about exploring multilingual voice hearers' experiences. Okay, thanks, Rachel.
Oh, can you hear and see me okay?
Yes, yeah, perfect.
I'm going to assume yes. So I'm gonna, I guess, start by figuring out the presentation. I'm going to start by introducing myself and the research topic more generally, and then go back a step and look at some definitions, because there's some bits that maybe people who have a more kind of psychology background might not be super familiar with the way that terms are used in linguistics, and potentially vice versa. So this is going to be about my master's research, my MA at Birkbeck in Applied Linguistics and Communication. I am a survivor researcher, and now I work particularly on kind of harms caused by state systems, so the NHS and various related other ones. And by survivor researcher, I mean that I use my experience of those systems to inform the way I do research. And I'll kind of get into some of the complexities of that in relation to this topic specifically as we go. But that's kind of quite closely tied up with political commitments for me, both within and outside research. So I am a research assistant with the QHRN's kind of opposite numbers at King's, the Qualitative Applied Health Research Network. And I'm also an associate member of the Service User Research Enterprise, and I'm on a 1+3 PhD program looking at experiences of suicide loss among communities of people who use mental health services together. So it's a bit of a pivot from this topic, but I'm still kind of thinking about this previous research quite a lot. So it came about because I studied some kind of basic sociolinguistics and a module in language and identity, and one on multilingualism during that master's at Birkbeck. And that involved a lot of stuff like thinking about accents and what they say about us, and like dialects and various aspects of language use. And I'm not a voice hearer, but I've been sort of circulating in the UK mental health system for like 12, 13 years now. So a lot of my close friendships are and have been with people I know either through directly using services together or through kind of bonding over our frustrations with the system, and the kind of various systems that we're subject to and disempowered by in various ways. So through those circles, I was kind of aware of the Hearing Voices movement, which is one particular lived experience survivor movement in that area. And they kind of really highlight the importance of what voices mean to the individual rather than what they represent in terms of symptoms or diagnosis. And I had some experience of doing qualitative research from a lived experience perspective. And I think the way that shows up, even if I'm not researching something that I have personal experience of, is that it tends to focus me very sharply on the ethics of the research, because like, not that I always get that right, obviously, but it's really important to me to give it a really good go, because I've been on the receiving end of services that are designed on the basis of either a flawed or kind of misinterpreted evidence base. And I can't put that experience aside when I'm doing this research, like it's there with me all the time. And it's kind of particularly sensitized me to like power dynamics in research, which again, I'll come back to. But so I remember very clearly like sitting in a class learning about accents in particular, and the kind of sociolinguistics that were related to it, and coming out and asking a friend, like, do your voices have accents? And they were like, well, voiceover is really complicated. Like, people have this really big range of experiences, and sometimes they don't really sound like a voice that you would literally hear, and sometimes the kind of auditory qualities that you have don't necessarily quite match up with like what you know about the voice. And like, but yeah, sometimes. So then I did this module in multilingualism, and that kind of brought together the psycholinguistics and the sociolinguistics. And I was like, I wonder how all of this relates to voice hearing. So this was how I ended up doing this as a dissertation. So my overarching question was, how do voice hearers who speak more than one language describe their experience of hearing voices? And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the first sub-question. How do the languages voices speak affect voice hearers' relationships with their voices? Partly because otherwise it would take forever, and partly because that's the bit that I've published, and I kind of still have it slightly in my head that I would like to write up the rest of it in a way that is not just my dissertation, but 3 years down the line still haven't quite got around to it. So I did 10 interviews with 10 people, and kind of adapted some existing tools. I picked this interview called the Maastricht interview because it has been kind of publicized by some national hearing voices networks and does have some questions on that kind of relationship between hearer and voice stuff. And I also did some training with Ray Waddingham, who's the chair of the Hearing Voices Network England and is a voice hearer, specifically on this kind of relational approach to voice hearing. And I've got a link to some of her stuff in the references at the end. So that kind of shaped the questions that I asked and the way that I asked them. And then I wrote it up using reflexive thematic analysis. So taking a step back to look at like what is voice hearing and what are the kind of primary theories on why it happens. These are taken from a project called Hearing the Voice. So hearing a voice of voices that other people can't hear, and it might be clear or it might not be. And so in clinical context, people often call it auditory hallucinations. I chose to call it voice hearing because I was kind of following the lead of the Hearing Voices Network, because some people prefer non-medical frameworks. Not everyone, like people just have really different approaches to it. So these are kind of some of the key ideas in why voice hearing might happen and how it might happen. And I guess the thing to say is that like a lot of work on voice hearing, even if it's not being researched as a symptom of an illness, kind of bears the imprint of the idea of schizophrenia, even if it's not examined through that framework, because it's kind of dominated research for quite a long time. And like historically, very particular kinds of voices were important to getting a schizophrenia diagnosis. So for example, like voices that are providing a running commentary on what somebody's doing. And I was kind of deliberately agnostic starting out on stuff around causation because I was aware that people have lots of really different ideas on it, and people have a lot of understandings imposed on them of what their experiences are. And I also kind of was deliberately like not prescriptive about the kinds of voice hearing that were important. So was deliberately not being like, oh, it needs to be a voice that sounds definitely like it's coming from outside your head and this and that, because it felt like I deliberately wanted to minimize the impact of diagnostic frameworks on the research that I was doing. Not because I think they're always a problem, but because they're not necessarily, like, I didn't want to impose it a priori, I guess. But there are some theories that are quite directly relevant. So, sorry, I'm just going to give my dog a treat so she keeps quiet. So this idea of misattributed in a speech is probably one of the most dominant theories of what voice hearing is and how it happens at the moment. So it's the idea that it's kind of verbal thoughts that are sort of somehow signals get scrambled somewhere. So it sounds like a voice that is coming from outside your head or is out of your control, even if it's inside, sounds like it's coming from inside your head. And I was interested in that because there's quite a lot of linguistic research on inner speech. It's difficult to research because people don't not everybody has an internal monologue, and lots of people who do, you don't necessarily think about it until you're researching it, because people tend to assume that everybody else's the inside of everybody else's head is kind of like the inside of my head, right? Until you kind of start asking people these questions, and then you realize, oh, actually, that's a like people have really different experiences of being inside their own heads. So yeah, that's, and I was kind of interested in the inner speech idea particularly, but not necessarily kind of wedded to it as an explanatory theory. Again, like this is just, so people who are not linguists tend to think of somebody who's like bilingual or multilingual as someone who has like equal knowledge of 2 or more languages, and actually that's actually quite rare. Like it's not unusual for people's language use to kind of follow the patterns, people's language knowledge to kind of follow the patterns of its use in kind of this complementary way. So like if you are used to using one language at work, you're much more likely to have like a fluency in the work context and with work vocabulary. And if you're using a different language at home, you have this kind of complementary pattern where you have a lot of proficiency in one language in work context and proficiency in a different language in a home context. It's not necessarily that you're kind of equally proficient in both areas in both languages. So I use the word multilingual to refer to anyone with knowledge of more than one language, just because it's saved words. And that's not an unusual convention in linguistics. And I also was deliberately quite broad about what I counted as knowing a language and what counted as a language, because what counts as a language and what counts as a dialect is often kind of a political decision. There's a really famous quote in linguistics that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And I was just kind of erring on the side of inclusiveness where possible with basically everything. The other thing to note is that first language in linguistics is quite a common convention to refer to any language learned before the age of 3 as a first language. So people can have more than one first language, which is one of those things that is just a little bit counterintuitive if you're not in that field. But in terms of existing research, I think the main thing to say is that like multilingual voice hearing has been quite significantly overlooked, and that linguistics and psychology and psychiatry kind of haven't really joined up. The literature that I read, there was a lot of focus on like psychiatrists' reports of their patients' experiences and behavior, and this kind of assumption running through that psychiatrists are reliable narrators, but voice hearers aren't, which I guess is where my survivor history really kicked in, because I think that's wrong, and I think it is, I mean, I think it's ethically wrong to be asking people stuff and then acting like you don't believe their answers. And I also think that it overestimates how reliable psychiatrists are when actually they're likely to just be describing people's own reports, but at secondhand. So at the time I looked at this through the language of epistemic injustice. Since then, I've kind of read a bit more around it and have come across this idea of willful hermeneutical ignorance, which is kind of a development of that idea, which I think is quite interesting and refocuses us a little bit on who's perpetrating that injustice. But anyway, there's also a really, really racist history to a lot of the research on multilingualism. So there was one early paper from the 1960s that talks about voices being like the result of so-called primitive peoples being unable to cope with the pressure and the speed of modernity. And that was not the worst. Like there was also some writing by like a white psychiatrist practicing in apartheid South Africa. So I'm not even gonna, like, you can kind of imagine the kinds of things that were written in that. But one kind of rare recent study was this mixed method study from 2020 looking at this Welsh English bilingual community and kind of testing the hypothesis of voice hearing being misattributed in a speech by looking at whether the patterns of voices languages kind of followed the patterns you would expect in a speech. And in terms of this thing about, so a lot of the older literature, it felt like that there was kind of a pre-existing narrative that people were trying to fit their case reports into, that people's experiences, people's voice hearing would reflect their experiences, kind of quite explicitly looking for parallels where there was any detail. And it felt like trying to fit the data to a theory. Like maybe that's a little bit harsh, but there wasn't a lot of methodological detail. So it was quite hard to assess like how the data was collected, like in what context. Yeah, there just wasn't a lot of detail to like work through the literature. And so I guess I was also kind of aware that like I like to think that I did better than like some of the doctors writing about their patients in terms of handling power. I was also really aware when I was reading this stuff that like I was going to be interpreting accounts from people who are already kind of over-interpreted a lot of the time and not taken at their word. So it felt like extra important to handle that with care. So I really felt like the limitations of being a student and having no funding and being kind of subject to an ethics committee's understanding of ethics and the demands of the postgrad course and all of that stuff. But I think in general, we tend to feel the power that we don't have a lot more than the power that we do. So it felt really important to me to be conscious of the fact that I was interpreting other people's experiences, and that does have the power to be painful if it's done badly or wrong. And that there wasn't necessarily a right of reply from the people that I was researching. And so what I want when I'm being researched is for the limitations of power sharing to be kind of acknowledged and for people to handle that stuff with care. So that's what I tried to do. So I asked everybody that I interviewed whether they wanted to read the outputs and whether they wanted to be invited to future events and stuff, and everybody said yes, which I think is probably a reflection of how under-researched these experiences are, that like people are quite keen to know how their experience fits with other people's. And I guess I tried to like think through when I'm sharing adverts with people and stuff like that, like, are there bits that could be really painful to read and flagging those up, that kind of thing. But I'm gonna move on to the results because I realize I can like talk about the sort of navel gazing self-reflection stuff about the experience of doing the research process for like also forever. So this table, just to kind of set the background against which I'm sharing the rest of the results. This table shows the details of the languages that people knew, what age they were when they started learning them, and the languages that their voices spoke. I'm not going to read all of them out because I will feel silly doing that. But I think the thing that I pulled out from this in my discussion of it is that it's not necessary for a language to be learned early for it to show up in people's voices, which was a little bit surprising. And in contrast to, for example, that Welsh English bilingual study, it didn't say that there were like no cases where a later learned language would show up in people's voices, but statistically it was, for instance, there were kind of associations between age of acquisition and whether people heard voices in the language, although that was complicated by like what the majority language of the language setting was. So it's not like an association can't have exceptions. So I'm not like, I don't think this disproves anything in that paper, but it does complicate the picture a little bit, because there are also minority languages here. So Scottish Gaelic being an example, that were learned late and still showed up in people's voices. So the other thing that's interesting is that it was quite common. I mean, look, there's lots of stuff that's interesting about this, but something which came up was that it was quite common among the people that I spoke to not understand or to partially understand the voices that people heard. And that I didn't really come across in the literature that I read. And it's quite difficult to do a kind of comprehensive literature review on, because there isn't like a clear fixed terminology for it. But yeah, I didn't find, I think, anything on it, certainly not very much. So I only want to talk about that a little bit more. So after I'd done these interviews, I kind of arranged those experiences of understanding and the kind of degrees and types of understanding into a spectrum, which isn't perfect as a metaphor, because there were also qualitative differences that weren't fully captured by a kind of linear approach. But I guess the point is that there's a really wide range of experiences, and that most people I spoke to had some experience of not fully understanding everything that their voices said. And as I kind of go through the results a bit more, it will kind of become clear that that could be really significant in lots of different ways for people. Sorry, that's just my dog begging me for a treat in the background. If you had a little woof there, she likes to get involved in my work. So this is the bottom end of the spectrum. It wouldn't all fit on one slide, but I guess this shows what I was saying about it not fully fitting in a line, right? From understanding everything to not understanding anything. Because there was also this experience of kind of getting a vibe on what the voice was saying, but without necessarily being able to kind of say, oh yeah, I can literally translate all of these words. I guess I would really like to have the space to explore more with people how they're identifying the languages when they don't fully understand them, and like literally what sounds they're hearing. I wonder whether some of the technology used in, for instance, avatar therapy, where people like reproduce the voices that they're hearing via an avatar, whether some of that technology might be channelable to kind of more exploring this not understood stuff. I don't know masses about avatar therapy, so I don't know how feasible that would be, but it's an idea that's occurred to me. And then, but also these were just associated with like this huge range of different emotional experiences. So these are the same person, quotes from the same person, and she talked about hearing this kind of muttering that kind of sounded vaguely French, and she would catch the odd word. And so she said, I feel like it's designed to confuse me. It doesn't feel like she's got good intentions towards me when she does that. But then she also heard Levantine Arabic, which is a language that she had learnt when she was young, or had around her when she was very young, and kind of felt very differently about hearing that. Like she said, it felt really comforting, and including a little bit that I cut off from this quote, like within a very short space of time, she said 4 times the word comforting, which is quite emphatic. Like, and I guess that contrast, like this is an example of a contrast within one person's experiences, but there was really like a whole constellation. And I guess what comes out is also like this real, the kind of use of multiple languages, or of kind of partial understanding, partially speaking a language that wasn't English, could really heighten the sense that somebody's voices were had kind of agency independent of them. And it could really heighten the kind of sense of unease that people could have. But I also think it's important to note that like voice hearing isn't always a negative experience, right? Like, I would say most of the people I spoke to, it was largely associated with distress, but not everyone and not all of the time. So sorry about the weird cat picture. It's quite difficult to find stock pictures that fit this topic appropriately. But so looking a little bit more in detail at like the relationship between people's language experiences and the languages that they heard in their voices. I mentioned that earlier research kind of felt like it was looking for quite explicit links between people's experiences in a language and the content of their voices. So reports would say, like, for instance, if somebody had positive early associations with the language, like speaking it with a safe family member, they would hear positive voices in that language. But if they had to, for example, flee a war zone and that early language became associated with danger, they would hear negative voices in it. So that's what one of the like earlier papers said. But it kind of wasn't backed up with a lot of like methodological detail or evidence. So I kind of had this sneaking suspicion that it would potentially be an oversimplification. So I tried to take quite an open approach and ask quite general questions. And that kind of link that was described in earlier research did exist, but it wasn't the most common, necessarily the most common kind. It certainly wasn't universal. But when I was writing this up, I thought about that through the metaphor of reflection. So this person said that, for example, when they had a crisis triggered by issues in their like Greek-speaking family, then they heard a lot of Greek voices, and those voices were kind of speaking about topics that related directly to that family stuff. So that kind of was reflected quite clearly. And they also said that in terms of like the proportion of time that they spent speaking Greek versus English, that was kind of, their voices spoke those languages roughly the same proportion. But there are also experiences that were a lot more complicated than that. And the metaphor that I used for this was refraction. So when light passes from air into water or through glass or like through a prism, then you still get a picture which is related to the thing, but something's a bit off. Something is different in sometimes subtle ways and sometimes really remarkable ways. And like, it's not a perfect metaphor, because if you get too into the physics of it, I'm sure it doesn't hold up, but like, I'm not a physicist. So, but so a kind of example of this is this person that I spoke to, who would see visions alongside hearing voices of people that he used to work with. And those people, when he had worked with them, spoke English. But when he saw them as visions, the voices that were associated with them were speaking Gujarati and Hindi. And I also spoke to somebody else who said, I hear a voice that like I can identify this is the voice of my dead grandmother, but like made kind of scary and demonic. That voice would be speaking Gaelic, but the dead grandmother had never spoken that language. So this kind of what I was talking about earlier with like if you speak a language in one setting, you develop this kind of pattern of proficiency of language in relation to the settings that you use it in. Something happens in the process of developing voice hearing, which complicates that in a way that I don't really know of any other areas of language where that happens, possibly dreaming, but generally that principle tends to, like what research there is on dreaming is methodologically very, very difficult, as you can imagine. And actually that kind of principle of complementarity tends to hold. So, I mean, I guess the main thing is that like this is a lot more complicated and there's a lot more complex relationships between people's language histories and the languages of their voices than was really kind of recognized or highlighted in earlier research. And this could also, I mean, we kind of hinted at this earlier with the stuff around the kind of French-ish muttering, but there were like really complicated power dynamics between the voice and the hearer, particularly where it felt like the voice had kind of external agency. And that could really heighten distress. So for example, this quote on the left, this kind of switching between languages is called code switching. It's probably a term that people are familiar with. It's quite common for multilingual people to code switch in this way, for like particularly for emphatic use, or like for kind of particularly heightened emotion. And quite a few people describe their voices doing this to kind of emphasize, for instance, if they were saying something nasty, like in this case, saying you're nothing, either because there's like a word that is kind of has a stronger sound or is more like onomatopoeic in the different language. So switching emphasizes that way, or sometimes because there's like particular grammatical constructions for emphasis that don't exist in English, say. And so they could kind of code switch to make use of, it felt like voices were like making use of all these different resources that multilingualism affords people to communicate in complicated and interesting ways. Generally, quite a few people kind of had that experience with their voices as well. And the quote on the right, this is something that I would like to explore a lot more. And in the kind of initial write-up of this, I think I could have thought more about maybe, is that people feel very different in different languages, like a lot of the time. And I'm maybe because of the context in which they use a particular language, or maybe because of the feeling that a language has for them, like for lots of different reasons, people feel like their personalities are expressed differently in different languages. And the way that could also kind of play into this kind of complicated power dynamic between people and the voices, which felt like they had really clear external agency to them. So that's kind of, there was lots of other stuff findings wise that came out of this, but quite aware of the time. So I'm gonna kind of move on to the conclusions that I drew from it, and then hopefully we can have some questions. Yeah, this is the dog who was making a fuss earlier. These are like the world's most orange slides. So I felt like she kind of fit. It's mostly a joke, but I do find that I do a lot of my like best thinking when I'm plodding around Hampstead Heath with her. But so I guess, as will have been obvious, hopefully, the main thing that came from this is how complicated it all is, which feels like a bit of a cop-out as a conclusion, because like everybody finishes their research being like, more research is needed in this area. But it really is, like, it was very much the tip of an iceberg. And there's a lot to explore around like how these experiences affect people's relationships with their languages as well, which was one of my other research questions, which I wrote about in my dissertation, but haven't yet managed to write up for publication. And there's also like a whole nother project looking into that more, or the potential for a whole nother project looking into that more. But because language is like a really core part of people's identity, right? So it makes sense that like language experiences affect voice hearing, but voice hearing is also an experience which happens in language. So it makes sense that those associations would then have like an emotional impact on the relationships that people have and the associations people have with the languages of their day-to-day lives. So yeah, I'm still hoping to kind of write some of my thoughts on that up, but and I think in terms of the kind of theories of voice hearing that I talked about at the beginning, the fact that so many people didn't understand or didn't fully understand their voices, I think is quite a challenge to the kind of dominance of this idea of misattributed inner speech, because generally you don't have inner speech that you don't understand. Not saying like, so there's some work on voice hearing that suggests that there's like subtypes that might have kind of might work in different ways. So I'm not saying that like none of this is ever inner speech, but I think it just really needs looking into more to kind of figure out the complexities of that. And I guess like beyond the specific conclusions, something that came out of this for me is that like when you start from the kind of open-ended qualitative perspective rather than kind of hypothesis testing, the picture you end up with is like quite different to the picture that comes out of, say, diagnostic constructs, in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So I would, I guess, very much advocate for more stuff in this research that is just asking quite open-ended questions of people, which, like, yeah, given an extra lifetime's worth of time and energy, I would love to do. And maybe, you know, maybe I will get to come back to this one day. So, and then I guess the thing that I wanted to think about to finish off, so I was invited to do this seminar after doing a blog piece that I wrote about the idea of like real world impact in research, because I presented this or some of this stuff to a research club of service users and clinicians in a recovery college. And I thought, well, that's kind of the kind of thing that in academia we're kind of encouraged to write up as real world impact of research, like taking our research out into the community and disseminating it far and wide. And like that's in some ways quite a noble goal, right? Like that's fine. But I think that that framing and the way that we have to write this stuff up, centering ourselves and centering, like taking stuff from the academy outwards, I feel like it underestimates the extent to which this knowledge comes from outside the university in the first place. Like I would actually like to have done a lot more work to get this stuff outside of universities, because I feel like fundamentally that's not where it belongs. Like it belongs to the communities that have these experiences and the people that gave me their time and energy during COVID. So like, I mean, not that COVID is over, but like during the really acute phase of COVID, and shared kind of quite intimate stuff with me. And it doesn't belong to me. It belongs with the communities that have those experiences. And it kind of feels like basic politeness to like put this stuff back where you found it. But there is kind of a tension there, right? Because we also talk about reflexivity in research and the idea that themes in thematic analysis don't just like come out of the data, right? They come from us as well. And there is a lot of me in this research. You know, I've talked about the ways that my experiences shape the way that I did it, and the metaphors that I use, like particular things jump out at me because of the things that I've read and the things that I've experienced and the way that my particular brain works. And I do think that's true. And I do think it's important to talk about that. But so there's maybe like a tension between what I feel is like a kind of moral obligation to center the people who actually gave us or gave me this knowledge and this information, and the kind of methodological like transparency stuff that also feels true to me, that like there is a lot of me in my research, and I haven't, shock news, I have not figured out how to resolve that really big question and tension. So I thought I would leave us with that messiness and see if, yeah, I would really welcome other people's thoughts and maybe we can have a bit of a discussion about it. And also any questions. Yeah, thank you so much. This is just the references which hopefully can be sent around if anybody is interested. But yeah, that's me. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen if I can work out how.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
That was brilliant. And we do have a lot of questions in the chat. So that's fantastic. And